So let's look at while loops. So a while loop, again, is what you typically use when you don't know in advance how many times you're going to execute the loop. Right? You just need to keep going until some condition is met. It turns out anything you can do with a for loop, you can do with a while loop, and vice versa. All right, so here's an example of a basic while loop showing all the elements that it has to have. The first thing is there has to be some condition here. So that's usually going to be some kind of relational expression. Some variable is not equal to, or is equal to, or greater than, or less than. Okay. But the key thing to understand here is it keeps executing the loop as long as this condition is true. It stops if this condition becomes false. And so people often get the logic backwards, because when we're describing what the loop does, we often tend to say, I want to keep doing this calculation until something happens. But the way you code it is the opposite. You say, keep doing it while that thing hasn't happened. Okay. All right, so in this case, we have some variable go, and we want to keep going as long as it isn't equal to 0. Or in other words, we want to keep going until it becomes 0. And how is it going to become 0? Well, in this case, the user is going to enter it. All right, so this is a key point. There has to be something in this block of code that allows this variable to change so that the condition can become false, so the loop will quit. Right? If we didn't have this line here, go would never change values, and this loop would go forever. Yeah, that's called an infinite loop. Very common mistake. All right, so in this case, we get the value of go from the user. And even though we're telling him to enter 1 or 0, in reality, if he enters anything other than 0, it's going to keep going. All right, so if we have this sequence here, the user enters 1 or 2 or 9, loop keeps executing. Finally, when the user enters 0, it stops. Now, another key point with while loops, this variable needs to get initialized to something. Otherwise, the first time it tries to check this condition, it says there is no such variable as go. It's undefined, so you get an error. All right, so you need to put an initialization line. So go has some value at the beginning. And you want to make sure you initialize it so that the loop will execute at least once. All right, so in this case, that means I can initialize it to anything other than 0. And that way the loop executes at least once, and then we get values of go from the user after that. All right, so initialize the loop variable, put some condition to check when to stop. And then there has to be something inside this block of code so that that variable can change states, and eventually this loop will terminate. Now, if the loop never terminates because you got the logic wrong and the condition is never becoming false, you type Control-C. And I found out during class yesterday, because somebody brought it up, this doesn't seem to work with live scripts, but you shouldn't really be using live scripts anyway. But with a regular script, if you're in an infinite loop, you just type Control-C, it'll terminate. And just a little bit of trivia. The address of Apple Computers headquarters in Cupertino, California is one infinite loop. A little computer science humor there. All right, let's go look at some more examples. All right, so my first example, and this is my favorite example for introducing while loops, is the guess the number game, where the computer generates a random number between 1 and 100, and the player has to guess it. All right, so it's a loop. You keep going until the player guesses correctly. So you use a while loop, but remember, you have to kind of reverse the logic. Keep going while the player has not guessed correctly. In other words, while the player's guess is not the same as the number the computer generated, you keep going. But that means this variable needs to get initialized to something. So if we initialize it to 0, that guarantees the loop will execute at least once because this number is between 1 and 100. It'll never be 0. All right, then somewhere inside this block of code, there better be some way that this value of guess can change. Well, the way we're doing it, we're getting it from the user. Okay? So the user keeps guessing as long as he has not guessed correctly. But that would be a really tedious game if we just kept saying, guess again, guess again, guess again. So you want to give the user some feedback. So inside the loop, we're going to put an if, else, if, else structure to tell the user whether he guessed too high or too low, or he got it correct. All right, so now we're starting to combine the different structures that we've studied. We've got an if structure inside a loop. And this is where programming starts to get complicated, putting the building blocks together. All right, but each time this loop executes, we do this check. Did he guess too high? If so, tell him that. Otherwise, did he guess too low? Tell him that. Otherwise, there's only one possibility remaining. That's correct. Now here I'm using message box because with live scripts, I just found that printing inside a loop doesn't seem to work correctly. It always seems to be one step behind. So I'm using a message box instead. But we'll learn this in a few weeks. But it's just opening up a separate window to display this message. All right, let's run it and see what happens. All right, so it says guess a number between 1 and 100. I'm going to say 50. And my message box pops up. And unfortunately, it's coming on my other screen. All right, so it says too high, guess again. All right, let me try 25. Too low. All right, let's say 37. Too high. 31. Too high. 28. Too low. I'm bracketing it here, but it's taking a long time. So between 28 and 30, let's try 31. Let's try 30. Too high. Let's try 29. Correct. Okay. All right. That took a long time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 guesses, but I finally got it. Okay. Now, the shortcoming of the way this game is programmed is it lets you keep guessing forever. All right, so you could just type 50, 49, 48, 47 until you get it. To make it a more realistic game, you've imposed some maximum number of guesses. Right? So we want to keep going until he gets it correct or he runs out of guesses. All right, so how would we write the condition, change the condition in the while loop so that it stops if he runs out of guesses? All right, so we're going to have a variable called num guesses, which will initialize to 0. So that's how many guesses he has made so far. So if that number reaches the maximum, that means he's made all his guesses and we quit. So if he hasn't guessed the number correctly yet, and he still has guesses remaining, then we keep going. All right, so again, you have to kind of reverse the logic. You would say, well, we keep going until he guesses correctly or he runs out of guesses. When you negate that, the or becomes an and. You say keep going while he hasn't guessed correctly and he hasn't run out of guesses. Okay. All right, so what do? Well, ask him for his next guess. Increment the number of guesses by 1. In other words, he just made one more guess, so we increase that number. And again, give him the usual feedback. Let's see how this works. And I'm going to reduce the number of guesses to 3 So this will go faster. All right, guess, I'm going to say 50. It said too high. And now I'm going to guess really foolishly. I'm going to guess 49. Too high. 48. Too high. But then it quit. All right, so it's working the way it should. It's kind of an unsatisfying ending. It just quit. It didn't tell me that I lost. So I should put something in so that if he runs out of guesses, I tell him, sorry, you're out of guesses, you lose. And I think the best way to do that, at least the way I see it as the cleanest way to do it, after you exit the loop, now check to see, why did we exit the loop? Was it because we ran out of guesses, or was it because we guessed correctly? So I'm going to do it this way. And there are several ways you could do this. I'm going to do it this way. If guess not equal to the number, that means he did not guess correctly. Then I'm going to say message box. Sorry, you are out of guesses. Better luck next time. All right, let's try that again. $50, too low. 51, too low. 52. Okay, so too low came up, and then, sorry, you're out of guesses. Okay. Now I could even make it a little better if I put some more thought into it, because the way it is right now, first this box comes up saying too low, guess again, but then this one comes up, which is a little confusing for the user, but it's good enough to illustrate what I wanted to show. Okay. You can give that some thought. How would you make this a little better so that you'd probably have to check inside the loop now? Do this check inside the loop so that you don't display this if the user has already run out of guesses.